Good evening, I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Let's begin with the latest COVID numbers. Malaysia reported 50 new COVID-19 cases today. This is the 6th consecutive day of double-digit infections. However, there was one new death today, which makes this the 93rd person in the country that we've lost to COVID. But also, let's turn our attention to the situation at the SELAYANG wholesale market, which is under an enhanced MCO. There were reports that the 16,000 residents affected by the lockdown hadn't received any food or aid. But in response to this, the KL Mayor has now assured that aid is on its way. The EMCO predominantly affects migrant workers and Rohingya refugees who earn a living at the SELAYANG wholesale market. And while this has brought out compassion in some, it's also brought out xenophobia in others. Now, this is particularly obvious on social media. We're seeing a lot of xenophobic comments and posts and tweets. Sharad, have you come across some of these?
Well, not personally, Melissa, because I tend to scroll very quickly through, the nasty bits of social media. But I think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, of course, is that existing attitudes, especially ones that are very negative, have tended to rear their ugly head during this time. So a crisis just exacerbates suspicion, hatred, concern, anxiety about strangers in our midst, and so on and so forth. Right. I mean, one of the chief ways in which people misunderstand this particular crisis is to kind of somehow attach meaning to the cluster. So if you have a cluster that has perhaps migrant workers, you think that something about migrant workers that's bringing the disease, right?
What about the tablet cluster? We were talking about
with the tablet cluster, it was, questions of religion, it was questions of irresponsibility. All these things suddenly get projected onto that cluster. I mean, it is a disease and it can affect anybody from Boris Johnson down to, Boris Johnson, because he's living in the US, in the UK. But the point is, at the end of the day...
the disease doesn't discriminate, right?
Yeah, not only does the disease doesn't discriminate, I mean, there's a public policy issue when it comes to this. Now, so food was the one question. Right. So now we have public money spent on non-citizen populations now. Will we have to do the same when a vaccine is found? Can we deal with this by dividing the population, citizen versus non-citizen? Right. Will we have to just accept that everybody will have to be treated equally in this pandemic because the virus does not discriminate? Well,
I've been wondering about this. I think this is quite an interesting time to kind of monitor the conversations, the chatter around this. There is an online petition campaign urging the government not to help tens of thousands of Rohingya refugees affected by the EMCO. And that, how many people have signed on to that petition? Yesterday, I think what doesn't help is the news reports and media reports coming out that perhaps are fanning the flames or a trigger, so to speak, to these xenophobic comments. Bernama reporting that a man believed to be a foreigner arrested while attempting to escape from the lockdown area of the SELAYANG wholesale market. Now, the real question should be, why are these people trying to escape? If it is in fact true that there was a man trying to escape, we should be asking about whether these migrants are those under the EMCO are trying to flee, the root causes of that. Are they undocumented? Is there a trust deficit to authorities? These are the questions we should be asking and trying to allay those concerns.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you deal with populations under EMCO, whether they're Malaysian or otherwise, right? Is it through a coercion? Or is it through cooperation? Now, how do you incentivize cooperation? Because that seems to be the more lasting, perhaps more effective way of doing it. It's not just for politically correct reasons, Melissa, that I say this, but it's just that when people are all of a similar mind about the need to battle this, and they are convinced that, in fact, staying put or practicing social distancing is beneficial to all, they will do it.
Yes.
Right? So, yes, you can erect watchtowers and you can have men with guns patrolling, but that's the coercive end of the strategy. And perhaps you have to have both in your bag of tools. Nevertheless, at the end of the day, public policy makers are going to have to deal with the question of undocumented workers in our midst, who are numbered in the hundreds of thousands. And those have to be dealt with in some sort of fashion so that they become cooperative rather than see the Malaysian authorities as a potential threat.
Well, speaking of the Rohingya community, according to Lilian Fan from the Asia Pacific Refugee Rights Network, refugees are facing difficulties in paying rent. Some have been evicted and are living in the streets right now. Now, this so-called rent crisis is not limited to just refugees. In fact, many in the low-income group are also at risk as their ability to earn a living is in jeopardy due to the pandemic. Now, what we're also seeing is that it's not just limited to, to the B40 group or to migrant workers or to refugees. It is many people are at risk because their incomes are at risk from the MCO.
Well, so you think about it, Melissa, if you have one or two instances of people being tossed out into the street because they can't pay their rent, that's not a public, problem of public concern, right? Because it's just one or two people. But if this was a generalized action taken by landlords who are impatient to get their money, who for whatever reason think that somehow they vacate their premises, others might come and actually pay rent at this point in time, whatever it is, it does become a problem for everybody because it will not be hygienic. There will be questions of safety that will suddenly arise, not just for people around them, but for the people who are now tossed out into the streets.
Well,
so a lot of negative consequences where landlords are allowed to evict tenants at this particular crisis.
I really think that this crisis has shone a light or brought to the surface the many issues regarding Malaysia's most vulnerable communities, but also the fact that more people are more vulnerable than we even realize. Most are more vulnerable than they appear. I'm thinking back to a Bank Negara survey that found 86% of urban households have zero savings. 86% have zero savings, and that most people, or I think 75% of Malaysians, said it was a challenge to raise 1,000 ringgit in cash in the event of an emergency. Now think about that. Most people are just one bad month away from financial hardship, and that's a real concern.
Yeah, and it's not just people, as you might notice, people in the B40. It might actually be people in the M40 as well, who, for whatever reason, in terms of their businesses, are now taking a hit. Are landlords going to be pushing them out on the street? And what is the consequence if that happens in the thousands?
This rent crisis is something we're going to keep a close eye on. But after this, we're going to turn our attention down south and take a closer look at the change in Singapore's COVID-19 response. It's been quite interesting, so stay tuned to consider this.
Buat apa kat luar tu, kerajaan kata duduk di rumah. Pagi-pagi hak mana duk keluar nak pergi nyorok tu tak payah, makan je rumah. Orang kata tak boleh keluar sebab apa? Kita bagi potong rangkaian COVID ni, bagi putus buang hampa buang merkit apa semua senang. Petang-petang tu tak payah duduk kat semurut macam ni. Minumlah dengan ayam, kopi, gantang kau, mirogo kan sedap. Tak gaduh keluar rumah apa semua, tak payah buat masalah. Ni Kia, main tambah ayak ni boleh keten sikit ni. Abang ni. Lepas tu bawa kunci backhoe tu semalam pergi merkit. Tinggal dekat parking kat tanah kewet pula. Aduh, lupa. Makan.
Assalamualaikum Rabbi.
Hello, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris, with me, Sharad Katan. We turn our attention now to Singapore, which has just confirmed 1,016 new COVID-19 cases today. This is the third consecutive day that Singapore has reported more than 1,000 new cases in a day. The vast majority of new cases are work permit holders residing in foreign worker dormitories. Now, up to just about a couple of weeks ago, Singapore was held up as a model of success in pandemic management. However, now critics are saying that Singapore's low-wage migrant worker population has been systematically excluded from the public health response. Joining us on the line now to tell us more about the situation in Singapore is Alex Ayuh, Vice President of rights group Transient Workers Count 2, or TWC2. Alex, good evening. Thank you for coming on the show tonight. Now, do you think were foreign workers overlooked in Singapore, in the Singapore government's COVID-19 response, Alex?
We certainly think so. I think they were very badly overlooked. It is not entirely surprising from the way Singapore treats migrant workers generally, but in this case, it has come with disastrous consequences. What kind of consequences? Well, you see, like, for example, you just mentioned a figure that there were 1,016 cases just announced today, right? Now, of these 1,016 cases, I think less than 20 were Singaporeans, and about 1,000 cases were migrant workers living in the dormitories primarily. So, if not for the problem of the migrant workers, Singapore would be, considered quite a success story still. But because we were so blind to the risk faced by the vulnerable community, that is the migrant worker, now we have a really, really huge problem on our hands.
Alex, could you help us understand what percentage of foreign workers in that low-wage category actually live in these dormitories said to be quite cramped, packed with lots of people, but clearly designed to manage people or to restrict movement of this population? Well,
out of the 1 million low-wage workers in Singapore, what we call the work permit holders, many of them would be domestic workers, and others would be Malaysians, who might come across the causeway. But there are about 300,000 who live in dormitories. Now, what is a dormitory? I need to kind of like paint a picture. It's a massive housing complex behind barbed wire fences with securities and security guards and surveillance cameras and all that. And yes, you are absolutely right. The men are housed in that, and they're almost all men, housed in there at 10, 15, or 20 people to a room, double-decker beds. The beds are maybe 1 meter apart, shared toilets, shared bathrooms, maybe 10 persons to a toilet. Really abysmal conditions and perfect for infection to spread.
So you're saying, Alex, that social distancing cannot be observed in these types of conditions?
Our organization, TWC2, has said that from the very beginning of this epidemic. We kind of like said, watch out, okay? All this rhetoric about social distancing, stay at home, it's safe, work from home, and all that kind of thing is meaningless when we're dealing with a community whose home means 20 people squeezed into a room. And, what do you mean by social distancing? And worst of all, when the virus cases began to climb, they got stricter and stricter about not allowing workers to leave these dormitories. In other words, they had to spend more and more of their free time in the dormitories. Finally, the dormitories are quarantined, and they are told to stay in the room 22 out of 24 hours every day. Oh. Now, that is almost the exact opposite of social distancing. It's like a prison, and no wonder the infection rates have gone up the way they have.
Alex, could you just clarify? I'm wondering how the lockdown, or what the Singapore government calls the circuit breaker strategy, applied differently to migrant workers in the dorms and versus, say, to Singaporeans at home?
Well, for the Singaporeans generally, I guess it's pretty similar to Malaysia's situation right now, which is that we are supposed to work from home, we are not supposed to go to the office. But generally, there is no particular restriction about going out and taking a walk or walking your dog or that kind of thing, so long as you do it alone and not in any social company. So there's still a sense of freedom. But of course, a lot of people are staying indoors. The roads are pretty empty, the buses are empty, trains are empty, but they are running. For the migrant workers in the dormitories, however, the dormitory imposes rather strict rules about who can enter and who can leave. And within the dormitories, they have internal company management that says when you can leave your room and when you can come downstairs. And many of these dormitories are also put under official quarantine by the government. So that really means that besides the dormitory management rules, there are also the government rules, which are very, very, very strict.
Alex, also, one of the comments that's come out of people who are trying to defend the Singapore government's policies is that the high numbers that are being comes out of the high level of testing that's actually being done. So you have a lot of positives in these dormitories because of universal testing within the dormitories. Doesn't really mean that people are getting sick, but do you understand where the testing or targeted testing might actually be raising numbers and perhaps creating a spectre around these dormitories that is undeserved?
No, actually, quite the opposite. I would contest that view. We have also been monitoring testing numbers. And frankly, in my view, testing numbers are nothing to boast about. They're actually rather low considering the number of cases we have. The number of cases are coming up not because they're being tested, but because they're symptomatic. So they're reporting fevers. They're certainly encouraged to report as soon as possible that once they have a cough or a fever. So yes, they are catching them as soon as it becomes symptomatic. Not because we are testing the huge migrant population in any widespread manner. But the danger with just waiting until symptoms appear and then counting it as a case is that we know by now there are such things as asymptomatic cases who are also infectious. So really, I think the situation is pretty out of control, in my opinion.
Right. Alex, can I ask you about public sentiment? Is there public sympathy for the plight of foreigners?
I'm glad to report that on the whole, we have had a surge of support in the kind of work, and lots of people have been voicing out that the previous conditions or the present conditions are quite unacceptable and very, very embarrassing, including very senior people in the establishment, but not exactly the political leaders themselves. They have to follow the script, no doubt. But at the same time, unfortunately, we also have a xenophobic strain in Singapore, and there are some people saying rather nasty, racist things. Fortunately, I think they're a small minority opinion.
Alex, very quickly, these dormitories were established long before the COVID crisis. What animated or what was the impetus for those dormitories? Will this crisis undo that? Will there be a major rethink about these massive dormitories for foreign workers?
Well, actually, I mean, to be fair, the dormitories represented a net improvement in their housing conditions as the dormitories came into view maybe about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, that kind of thing. Because before that, the migrant workers were living here and there in shared rooms and shared apartments. And, of course, they wanted to save money. So, they really crammed themselves even tighter in those very unhygienic places. So, in a sense, the dormitories were built in order to give them slightly better accommodation, but as we now know, slightly better is not good enough. So that's one. Moving forward, well, I think we have noted the Minister for Manpower's statement that once the crisis is over, we really must look at the standards that we apply to dormitories. So I'm hopeful about further improvement in the housing conditions, but I think that this is only one aspect of Singapore's mistreatment of migrant workers. There are also such issues as abysmally low salaries, difficulty in accessing medical care, salary injustices, and so forth. And I'm not sure that COVID-19 is the motivation to fix those other problems, which are just as great in normal times.
Understood. Alex, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Keep up the good work. All the best to you over there and your team. Now we're going to take a quick break. More on this topic in just a few minutes, so stay tuned to consider this.
Assalamualaikum, adik kakak. Ni nak pesan ni kepada seluruh rakyat Malaysia dengan penonton Astro AWANI. Jangan tubik deh. Duduk rumah elok-elok. Jangan derak. Duduk rumah. Kita jaga kita. Demo jaga demo. Kita jaga kita. Demo jaga demo. Bye.
Hai, Assalamualaikum. Saya Hilal Azmi. Ni nak cakap dalam bahasa Penang untuk hampa semua supaya hampa semua dengar. Duduk rumah, tak payah duduk keluar pergi mana-mana. Sebab apa? Ni waktu PKP ni waktu untuk kita sama-sama lawan virus COVID-19 ni. Sebab apa virus ni?
Thank you for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the COVID-19 situation in Singapore. There was initial success in keeping infection numbers low. However, critics have pointed out that Singapore had failed to prepare for the possibility of an outbreak among foreign workers who were vulnerable to the infection. Joining us on the line now, we have Bilveer Singh, Associate Professor of Political Science at the National University of Singapore. Bilveer, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Now, could you begin by talking us through what happened with Singapore's pandemic management strategy? I mean, was it a fair comment to have said that Singapore had failed to include foreign workers in its public health response?
I think that's really sweeping too much about the whole situation. I don't think one swallow means there's a rain, you know. I think the way we managed, there was a calibration of approaches, and there were basically 4 waves from end January to mid-February, when the Wuhan guys were coming back here, followed by how they came back and created local clusters, followed by then the next wave of outsiders, basically Singaporeans and PRs coming back. And then the 4th wave basically is largely local in concentration, which is community as well as what you have just said about foreign dorms in Singapore. I mean, sometimes you get the image and impression that foreign workers are slaves here. I mean, come on. If that was the situation, I don't think they will come here because more than 1.4 million workers here. And the reasons are quite obvious. But the strategies which we took was first bring that back and then detect, isolate, manage as much as we can. And following the last one, try to basically detect where the main problem is coming from. And today, the primary source basically are the 43 dorms, of which we have isolated 19. And I think that's the approach. There's no way of saying that the foreign workers are the primary cause. I think the main reason we went through was because of the aggressive testing which we undertook in the last couple of weeks. Right. Initially, the focus, of course, was on Singaporeans. And since then, we are looking at the whole picture as a whole. And then I think that's where we are. I'm sure 10,000 numbers is quite huge by any consideration in the region. But I don't think there's a crisis here. I don't know what is the sense you get, but I live to a couple of dorms near here where I'm living. I don't think the situation is as it's often projected that is a failure. I doubt. Just a while ago, the Minister of Home Affairs was at the dorm where I'm staying. So I don't think we should actually sweep it as a failure from a gold standard to a null and void into sweeping.
How does the general public respond to the communication strategy of the government? Is there a consensus around this extension around the circuit breaker? First the circuit breaker, now the extension of the circuit breaker till the 1st of June. Is there a consensus?
I think very much so, partly because I think the manner the communication strategies was undertaken, by the way, the man who led it was the Prime Minister himself, 5 direct communications with the public, and we have an interministerial task force, and from the very top right down to the very bottom, everyone is involved in communication, mainly to share information. Now, when you have a circuit breaker to an enhanced circuit breaker, the reasons are quite obvious because we are spending in terms of the infection But actually, the worrisome thing is not the foreign dorms. The worrisome thing is that we do not know among ourselves who are those who are infected. So the reason we need enhanced circuit breaker is basically to flatten the curve and then stop it. And I think most Singaporeans will go with it. One of the reasons, because it's the whole fear of the infection, simple as that.
Can I ask you, Bilveer, how Singapore is communicating perhaps an exit strategy from this enhanced so-called circuit breaker? Has the government articulated how Singapore is benchmarking its success in fighting the virus?
I think there are a couple of things. One, we look at the number of infections, we want to bring them down. We have succeeded in bringing the Singaporean infections down. We want to keep the fatality as low as possible. The next thing is, I think we need to keep the Singaporeans indoor as possible. And here we have got the persuasion strategy, the compensation strategy, and then we have the punitive strategy for those who flop those laws. The whole game is a simple one. We are readying ourselves to bounce back the moment the virus is conquered. And I think this bouncing back will be in phases. And I think all of us are preparing. I'm from the university. We are getting ready to bounce back. My wife runs the education institution. We are getting to bounce back. So I don't think there is this sense of the game is over and we are down. It's just the reverse. The basic ideology which runs Singapore today
can I just
resilience.
interrupt you and get you to clarify what you mean by bounce back? Is that going back to how it was before, going back to normal business as usual?
There can never be business as usual after what has happened. This is one of the worst crises we have been through. And at the end of the day, what happened must never be repeated again. If we need to actually reconfigure the dorms, so be it. If we need to do so many other things, so be it. I think life will not be the same again. It will be post-COVID. And I see the public, I call this a COVID generation. I think the impact on them is amazing. The next thing is that we live and die because of the foreign workers. We need them. And the fact that we are paying everything for them, salaries, medical, housing, food, and even their communication back home is a clear indication of where we are going to go after this. The foreign worker is going to be a central player as far as Singapore is concerned after this.
Okay, Bilveer, the last question for you. We have about a minute left. The economic concerns that are global now about the impact of COVID, what exactly has been planned for Singapore to, as it were, bounce back on the economic front?
One, fortunately, we are quite strong economically in terms of our reserves and so on and so forth. Number two, unfortunately, we are a trading nation. We can only bounce back as strongly as the world will bounce back. But having said that, I think we are not about to collapse. So while being a trading nation, we are preparing for what we can do. At the end of the day, I think we need to give the confidence to the people that we are not going down. And I think that's where we are today. In terms of the nitty-gritty, I think we have to depend on the regional economy and the global economy. And let's see where we go.
Bilveer, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Appreciate your time and your insights from down there in Singapore. Stay safe, and that's all the time we have for you here on the show tonight for Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris with me, Sharad Kitten, signing off for this evening. Thank you so much for watching, folks, and good night.